The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross was one of the most controversial books written in the 20th century. Not since Darwin's On the Origin of Species had a book caused such outrage. John Marco Allegro was a respected Dead Sea Scrolls scholar and had just left his post as a lecturer at Manchester University. His infamous 1970 book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, revealed that Judeo-Christianity is based on an ancient fertility mushroom cult. Judy is the daughter of John Marco Allegro. She works as a freelance writer and editor, mainly for Plain Language Commission, where she's involved in turning all sorts of documents into readable and meaningful English. Besides her book, John Marco Allegro, The Maverick of the Dead Sea Scrolls, she has written a number of articles about her father's work, as well as various others about writing in clear, plain English. Judy, welcome to Gnostic Media Research and Publishing's podcast number 44. How are you this morning?
I'm fine, thanks. Nice to be here.
All right, so, well, you talked a little bit about who was John Marco Allegro, and so why was he so controversial? Beginning, why don't you start off with the Dead Sea Scrolls and then work into his later work?
Right, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls was where he made his name. He was one of the first editors, and as you said, he was certainly the most controversial of the set. Why he was controversial was because he was always asking uncomfortable questions, which brought him into conflict with the religious and academic establishment of the day. These questions mostly came out of his study of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their significance for the development of Christianity, a topic that not many other of the editors were all that keen to go into, for fairly obvious reasons, since they were mostly Catholic or Lutheran priests. Anyway, the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, it's important to have a basic background on what they were so that you can appreciate how they were significant, I think. They're a collection of biblical and sectarian texts. They're written down around the time Jesus is supposed to have lived and in much the same area. They were found hidden in caves in cliffs to the west of the Dead Sea. Some of them intact in earthenware jars, some in pieces among the dust and back droppings on the cave floor. Now most, but not all scholars, associate them with the ruins of a monastery nearby, Qumran. And from references within the scroll texts and from contemporary writings by people like Josephus, the historian, they think Qumran may have been headquarters of an extremist Jewish sect called the Essenes. The scrolls cast light on the beliefs and practices of this sect, and in those beliefs and practices, according to John in particular, we see many of the themes, ideas, and even the phraseology of another emerging Jewish sect known as Christianity.
You know, I've heard people rumored, and obviously it's not true, but that was the only book that he ever wrote on his research on the mushrooms. But he had actually written several books, and you had just mentioned another one, which was the follow-up or part two, his book, The End of a Road. And then after that, he wrote actually, 5 more books, but 4 additional books that furthered his research in that he laid out in The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, and he wrote The Chosen People, Lost Gods, and he also wrote a book that's actually rather famous even today and still in print, called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth. Would you like to talk about that book and maybe go in a little bit into his other books? In fact, if you wouldn't mind, would you just discuss briefly what each of those books were about, The End of the Road, The Chosen People, Lost Gods, etc., and give people just a brief background on what they were about?
Well, The End of the Road was, as you said, a sequel to The Sacred Mushroom, in that it was looking at what John felt the consequences ought to be of doing without religion in your life. It presented the humanist side of morality, the need for people to take responsibility for themselves, and not to rest on apparently God-given morality. If they could no longer believe that they were being directed to act in a certain way by God, Jesus, and that crew, they had to think of it for themselves. And this ought reasonably to be a much more a much sounder way of conducting your life. Not everybody saw it that way, of course, but as I said, among students, humanists, anybody sort of interested in morality on a personal level, that was quite popular, that book. And it's easy to read and only a slim volume, so that did do quite well, I think, for a short time. The Chosen People is a history of the Jewish peoples from Old Testament times onwards. He used a great number of contemporary sources, the Greek, Roman classicists and historians, and in general terms he shows the genesis of the sort of the Jewish nationhood dream, and that was continually tested out and tried out in one expedition after another, a sort of cyclical view of history that you can see recurring throughout the scrolls. It's very readable, and it's worth looking up for an inside view of the whole history of the Jewish nation. It has some points that make people sort of wonder: is this interpretation right, or what's the evidence for that? But it's a fairly fresh air attempt to be objective about it. I think it's worth looking at. The Christian myth. John was most proud of this book. He felt that it was probably what he called his ultimate book about the scrolls, but it was taking a different angle on his research on the scrolls, and also on the theories behind the sacred mushroom. He went back to the scrolls for writing it, and what they reveal of the worldview of the people who wrote them, the Essenes from Qumran. This new book, it shows how and why Essene concepts evolved into Christianity, and how the early church fathers spun these into a sort of web of temporal and moral authority, the birth and development of the religion as such. John held the strength of this web, Christianity, came not from an accident of history in the birth of Jesus, as we generally accept or are told happened, but from a much older source in age-old myth and prophecy. These Essene links, which, as I said before, they recur loud and clear in the language and imagery of the New Testament, include things like the Council of 12, echoed in the 12 Disciples, the idea of redemptive sacrifice, the communal meal, names derived from titles, and the whole focus on grace and divine light. Now, key to the theology of the scrolls, according to John in this book, is the incarnate Redeemer, who is known as divine knowledge or wisdom personified. It all gets very philosophical. Wisdom is also called the Word and divine light, and it's personified in various forms throughout the scrolls and the Bible, and also in the alternatives to the Bible, the Gnostic Gospels that were discovered about the same time. Some of the personifications appear as the firstborn, the bride of God, the mother of earth. They're all manifestations of the same divine essence. Again, in the New Testament, the Word is personified. It becomes flesh in Jesus, the Redeemer. Jesus is of the light, the divine essence. The terminology recurs. It's like echoes throughout the Bible and throughout these other texts. The puzzling thing is how it was sort of engineered to make sure that we only hear about the four Gospels. We don't hear anything about the Essenes, and we don't hear very much about the Gnostic Gospels.